Welcome back to Sunday Agenda. Coming up on the program, our panel, Andrew Clennell from The Australian and James Campbell from the Herald Sun. Paul Kelly still with us, of course, as well. Now to one of the week's most interesting controversies on the Labor side of politics. Michael Danby has held the seat of Melbourne Ports for 19 years. The seat has a strong Jewish constituency, and Michael Danby is Parliament's strongest champion of all things Israel. He's run into trouble this week, though, for using his taxpayer-funded electoral allowance to pay for ads in the Australian Jewish News, attacking a journalist. He placed 2 ads in the paper targeting ABC Middle East correspondent Sophie McNeil, accusing her of anti-Israel bias in her coverage. The ABC hit back strongly, claiming Michael Danby had made false claims in one of the ads. Labor leader Bill Shorten wasn't impressed either, and is said to have made it clear to Mr Danby himself. So is Michael Danby making any apologies for this, or does he stand by his actions? Let's find out. Michael Danby, welcome to the program. Thank you for your time. Let me start by asking you, and look, politicians attacking journalists is nothing new, and nothing wrong with free speech. But should you really have used taxpayer funds to place these ads? Why not fork out from your own pocket?
Good morning, Paul and David. I spend my communications allowances, every other member of Parliament does, on communicating a wide range of issues to people. People in my constituency, as you pointed out, there's a large section of the Jewish community concerned about fair and balanced coverage from the Middle East, and they'd been raising this issue with me for a long time. In proportion to all of the other stuff that I do on Victorian infrastructure or on same-sex marriage, I've spent a lot more on that. This is a proportionate use of to represent the constituents in my electorate, and I feel like I'm only doing my job. I don't think it's fair to say that politicians all around Australia can go hard on all these other issues, but only Danby shouldn't speak on this issue to represent part of his constituency.
All right, so no apologies from the sounds of that for using your taxpayer-funded allowance in this way. What about the content, though, of the first ad? I mean, the ABC points out, you said in the first ad that Sophie McNeil filed no report on 3 Israelis being stabbed to death in July while celebrating Shabbat. Do you accept this was incorrect? She did file TV, radio, online stories on this issue?
Actually, David, the ad said minimal coverage. And
right.
Yes, look, my constituents are concerned about the fact that on one occasion she reported a Palestinian family who were evicted. That was a human interest story. Their names were mentioned. And if you go back and look at her reports, what I said was entirely accurate. While she did report that there were incidents, the family wasn't named. There was no human interest story. And there were no pictures of the poor people who were murdered in that terrorist attack. And that's what upset my constituents. And that's why, being a reasonable person, I represented them as strongly as I represent people when they think Malcolm Turnbull's not spending enough money on infrastructure in Victoria.
Michael Danby, did Bill Shorten reprimand you for this action? And what was your response to the Labor leader?
Well, look, Bill and I have been friends for a long time, since he was at university. I'm not his favourite person this week, but these disagreements happen in politics. He made the point that the ads weren't the most subtle way of communicating that message. I accept that that's his view. I was simply trying to represent my constituency, who are very concerned about what they thought was the coverage of one family in a human way and a dehumanised way, reporting the Israeli family who were killed in a terrorist attack.
I appreciate that point you've just made, but did you tell Bill Shorten that there would be no more ads, that you wouldn't be doing this anymore?
Well, obviously he thought they were unsubtle, and I've pulled back and said that I won't be doing ads on the Jerusalem correspondent of the ABC, in the future.
So essentially, Michael Danby, you've been pulled into line. You're not going to do this again.
Well, I don't resile at all from the content of my criticism. Again, if you go to the reporters' reports of that terrorist incident, there's no mention of the name of the family, there are no pictures of them, and there was no human interest story. So that was my point. But, you know, if people think it was made in an unsubtle way, if my friend Bill Shorten thought it was a problem, I think he's been a great national leader. I support him. I think he's going to win the next election, and it's not something that I want to have a big fight with an old friend.
What about you at the next election? Because this whole thing this week seems to have stirred up some of your internal critics. I see some senior Labor figures are quoted saying they expect you to announce you're leaving politics at the next election, and if not, you might face a pre-selection challenge. What do you say to that?
Well, I'm not really focused on that. I haven't thought about that issue yet, but I'm, you know, fiercely representing this constituency in all of the areas that I normally do, and you know, it's not an issue that particularly concerns me. And it's interesting that there are no names to this thing. I've won Melbourne Port 7 times. I'm very grateful to the party and constituents for their support. It's a very difficult seat, and I think that record speaks for itself.
As you say, you've got a long record in the seat. You were, though, under pressure at the last election. Isn't it fair to say that within the internal politics of the Labor Party, there is a move to dump you for the next election?
I don't think that that's true at all, Paul. People know me. I'm pretty good at counting, and I've got a lot of support amongst the branch membership, and a lot of support amongst that other constituency in the Labor Party, the unions in Victoria. So I'm not concerned about that. People will use these opportunities when you're a bit unpopular or perceived by some people as having, you know, done something that's not popular to push other agendas with you. But it's not something that concerns me. I think we've won Melbourne Port 7 times. Robert Ray, a former numbers man in Victoria, said after I was elected that he thought the seat could only be held for 2 elections because of changing demographics. I think I've done a really hard task for the Labor Party and held this marginal seat for a long time and done it well, fiercely on a whole range of issues. Although I'm particularly pleased how I via advertising, which no one seems to have criticised, with colleagues and via the social media, forced Malcolm Turnbull to spend more on infrastructure in Victoria. That's a great thing.
How concerned are you that on the question of recognition of a Palestinian state and Labor policy, that Bill Shorten, under intense internal pressure, is going to have to make very substantial concessions on this issue?
Well, I think you know, Bill's position on this is well known. I think there are pressure from the various states. Things will work out as they do. Interestingly, in West Australia recently, there was a resolution passed that was fair and balanced. Indeed, at the New South Wales conference, to everyone's surprise, there was a similar kind of resolution. I'm not particularly concerned about that. I think this issue shouldn't be exaggerated in terms of its importance in Australian politics. I think Bill Shorten's doing a great job as national leader, and he shouldn't be diverted by over-concentration on this issue.
Well, I'd just like to tease that out a little, if we can there, Michael Danby. You referenced New South Wales, figures in the New South Wales right of the Labor Party certainly have been, you know, advocating a more pro-Palestinian position and indeed a more pro-China position, as you know, the likes of former Premier Bob Carr, who's been getting stuck into you this week, but also Chris Bowen, just in the last couple of weeks, outlining this new policy to engage more deeply with China and so on. Does that worry you at all? Do you feel personally out of step with the direction the New South Wales right is heading in?
Well, look, you mentioned 2 people there. Chris Bowen is in a completely different class from Bob Carr, who, my differences with him are well known, both on China and Israel. Chris said in an interesting speech to the Asia Society that Australia should judge investment from China on a case-by-case basis, and I think with $169 billion of investment by China in Australia over the last 5 years, $169 billion, they're the figures from the Foreign Investment Review Board. We've been doing that, and I think we should continue to do that, and I think Chris's views are very sensible. I think we made a mistake with the Port of Darwin, but in Victoria, where 25% of the sale of the Port of Victoria was engineered for $9.7 billion, that was the right thing to do, and FIRB didn't demur.
So the suggestion that Bill Shorten is being drawn closer to the New South Wales right in this pro-China position, and that some of his faction allies in Victoria, including yourself, are concerned about this or are unsettled by this, is that true?
I think that report was in the Australian newspaper was exaggerated, but Bill's a national leader. I mean, he's got to speak to people in New South Wales. I mean, Sydney is the largest population city in Australia. How ridiculous to say that he shouldn't be speaking to people all around the country and balance all of the interests. He's done a great job in keeping the party united. Everyone thought that after our defeat at the last election that we would be more fractured, more acrimonious, but we've been a united lot, and it's been a marked contrast to the government and the Liberals fighting all the time between themselves.
One of the main themes of the Chris Bowen speech on China, which has been really endorsed, if you like, by the Labor leadership, is that Labor should be far more proactive with the Belt and Road Initiative, the grand initiative of the Chinese president, and that Australia should be welcoming of that and seek more Chinese investment under that Belt and Road framework. Now, a number of strategic analysts have warned of the risks of this. What's your position on that proposition?
Well, I think we could hardly have more Chinese investment. We have had in the last 5 years $169 billion of investment by China in Australia. I encourage that. I think Australia should be colourblind. We're a capital poor country. We need investment when it's in our commercial interests. When it's not in our commercial interests, when it has a strategic aspect to it, I think that from now on FIRB will rule out investment like the Port of Darwin, as it did with Ausgrid, but I have no problem with Chinese investment, and I support Chris Bowen's view that it should be done on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we need to get involved, Paul, with the slogans of the Beijing government to encourage investment from China. We should just do it on the basis that we're doing it now, which is very successful, huge and sustained level of investment. But we shouldn't be prejudiced against it like some people wanted us to be against Japanese investment in the 1980s. So, look, it is not something that concerns me. I think that report in The Australian was, as I said, a little exaggerated, but Chinese investment, yes, slogans, not necessarily.
I know that Chris Bowen has said Chinese investment should be considered on a case-by-case basis, which of course is the logical thing to do. Both sides of politics adhere to that. However, you talk about slogans. The firm position of Labor is that it should operate with China in terms of working with the Chinese president and Chinese government on the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is the essential strategic framework identified by the Chinese government. Now, I ask again, do you endorse that position or not?
Paul, it's being very dogmatic to sort of ask a Labor backbencher to endorse some policy of the Chinese government. I don't endorse that Australia being involved in one belt, one road, without consideration of the individual circumstances. And I think Chris Bowen covered that off perfectly well by saying that we should be involved in having investment from China in on a case-by-case basis, and we have encouraged it. We've got an enormous amount of sustained investment by China, as we have from other countries in Australia. It's very helpful to our development, and you know, I'm not concerned about it at all. I think the Foreign Investment Review Board's approval of the sale of the Port of Victoria is evidence of the fact that we can have great investment by Australia's largest trading partner in China without there being any strategic problem at all.
Let me just tease out one more on this Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, what's the reluctance to jump in boots and all with this Chinese program? Is there a concern on your part that it is, at least in part, not just an infrastructure and economic program, that it is very much a strategic initiative from Beijing when it comes to, you know, dependent states?
Well, that's what's, as Paul said, claimed by strategic experts in Australia, that it has that aspect. And Australia, including Labor, has made it very clear that we support the international rules-based order on the South China Sea. 60% of our maritime trade transits that sea. We want that to be continuing to be free. You know, all of our trade with Korea, Taiwan, indeed China itself, and Japan, Korea go through that sea. So, you know, we have on foreign policy, both Labor and the government, some differences with the government in Beijing, and we ought not to surrender them because of our desire to get big economic investment, which we are getting and we should support, but we should do it on a case-by-case basis, as Chris Bowen said.
Let me return to the Middle East. Donald Trump, the US president, has restated his intention during the week to shift the US embassy to Jerusalem. I know Tony Abbott has suggested that's something we should consider for Australia's part as well. Where do you stand on that?
Look, in the big scheme of things, I think that it would be a good thing. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's purely a symbolic issue. I think it's much more serious that Australia is, and Julie Bishop is getting out of alignment with the rest of the world in her failure to say anything about Iranian ballistic missile tests, which are much more of a threat to both Saudi Arabia and Israel in the region. And that's something I think we should focus on more. I think it's great that the Australian government has a consistent policy of opposing North Korean ballistic missile tests, but we should join the socialist government or the left of centre government in France and other European governments in expressing to Iran that this is not in the spirit of the nuclear agreement that was made with them to continually fire off ballistic missiles and obviously frighten their neighbours.
Just going back to the question of China, Michael Danby, we know that our intelligence and security agencies are very concerned about Chinese involvement and Chinese money in Australian politics and what might be the ramifications of this. How deep is your worry about this yourself?
Look, I think we obviously have a different political system than China. They're ostensibly still a communist country. Their record on human rights, on executions of people, on the death of the Chinese Nobel Peace Prize winner in virtually a judicial murder, is not something that Australians would identify with. I think the serious takeout for Australian politics from this, Paul, is that, as you know, both sides are committed to a reform of the foreign donations laws, and I think the Joint Select Committee on Electoral Matters will come up with some recommendations which both sides of politics will support. Bill Shorten, our leader, has already announced that Labor will be supporting reform to ban foreign political donations.
Do you think we are being compromised by China?
Look, every country, including China, which is the most important foreign policy relationship with Australia, is trying to influence Australia in their direction. So to that extent, it's natural, but there are some unsubtle things that academics, investigative journalists, people in politics allege about the Chinese taking this a bridge further. And I think the exposure by the Australian media of these kind of issues, you and David and your colleagues in the print media are providing a good sort of balance to that. So, including the ABC. So, I don't want people to think that sort of I'm a blanket critic of the ABC. There was a great Four Corners program on this recently, and I think that's the way of redressing these things, Paul. Not by getting you know, overly concerned about them, but when wrong things happen, as the great Professor Fitzgerald pointed out in the Financial Review, the fellow from Swinburne University, Australian universities should operate in a way that doesn't compromise free inquiry and the kind of spirit that we have in Australian academia, while at the same time welcoming Confucius Institutes or Chinese language studies around Australia.
Michael Danby, we will have to leave it there. We appreciate your time today. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, guys, for having me. It's wish I'd had a chance to put my view on other networks as well, but I'm doing it once, and it's with you guys. Thank you.
Well, good to hear. Thank you very much. We're going to take a break, then back with